I'll be chairing this session and trying to keep it on time. We'll have 4 speakers today, so we'll aim at about 15 minutes each talk, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions at the end of each talk, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end of the session, where we'll have speakers out here in front, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So the first speaker is Helena Pohlandt-McCormick, who is Associate Professor of History at CLA.
Close this so I can put that paper down?
Sure.
What is the...
Is there...
Maybe just move it? Can we move it? No.
Oh, you...
Oh, just a second. That's fine. Yeah, I just need a bit of space.
It's okay.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to talk here today. I'm going to talk about a collaboration between the University of Minnesota's Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, ICGC, and the University of the Western Cape and the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. This is a collaboration that has deep roots, old roots, but was sort of and is also funded by an MOU and a major Mellon grant that supports the collaboration between ICGC and the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Minnesota. I got involved with this collaboration more deeply, although I have roots in ICGC myself, when Professor Pramesh Lalu and Fernando Arenas, who since left the U, and I, we applied for one of these spotlight grants, and actually didn't get one of the big grants, but we did get a seed grant, which we've been able to grow into all sorts of very interesting things, supported also by ICGC's program called the ICGC UWC Mellon Research Chair. That's a lot to get your tongue around, which provides for 2 chairs from each of the universities to help build this collaboration. And my colleague in that is Professor Leslie Witz at the University of the Western Cape, who's currently at the U as a visiting chair as well. So in the 5 years since we've gotten the grant, we've actually managed to expand the collaboration beyond the first 2 institutions to include the University of Fort Hare, which you may or may not know is Nelson Mandela's alma mater, and to the South African Research Chair in Social Change there, which is held by Professor Gary Minkley. The fact that the 2 South African universities that are part of this collaboration are historically black universities provides a natural link with the land-grant mission of our university and contributes substantially to our university's undertaking to internationalize its curriculum and to strengthen its international standing. The collaboration involves an exchange of faculty and graduate students. It goes in both directions, sometimes for 3 to 4 months at a time, but also for shorter visits. It involves small workshops and conferences, colloquia, and an annual winter school, which is now in its 5th year, research and writing collaborations, graduate teaching, reading groups, and dissertation writing groups. So quite a substantial program. We think that this is an intellectually very important and vibrant exchange that is in a position now to effect some significant shifts in African scholarship and in scholarship on or from Africa. In this sense, none of these institutions or the individuals that are part of this collaboration stand alone. Together, we've created research and a research culture and practice and a set of institutional forms and relationships that we quite ambitiously hope will change post-colonial humanities scholarship on the continent and beyond. The U of M and ICGC community play a central part in this, but the University of the Western Cape and the University of Fort Hare are equal partners in this. So rather than provide you with an inventory of the many initiatives that we've created, I want to emphasize that at the core of this collaboration is an intellectual project and an intellectual commitment by the participating institutions and, importantly, by the individuals, students and faculty that participate in the work of this collaboration. So this has two components. One is a public scholarship component, which is central to the history and to the work of the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape, which we recently brought to Minnesota, a branch of that through an emerging scholars workshop around public history from the global south. I want to talk to the other component, which is the critical humanities on the one hand and the post-apartheid or post-colonial perspective on the other. At the sort of broadest level, what this means is that the collaboration has shown how much we have to learn from and be inspired by the critical work being done in Africa and in Southern Africa in particular. The collaboration, more than anything else, helps to shift the bias away from a Western weight on Northern scholarship and Northern expertise. So let me talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about the critical humanities. The critical humanities need to attend to questions of what it means to be human, what it has meant to be human, that's the historian, and what it might mean to be human. And historians are increasingly interested in the future as well. And it seems increasingly that this has also been thought in relation to the non-human, which means needing to both account for and subvert disciplines and dichotomies, including those between the humanities and the sciences. In South Africa, what it means to be human is at almost every level, institutionally, in the public sphere, personally, and in everyday life, shaped by the legacy and the reality of what Georges Didi Huberman calls the ethical problem of racial hate, humiliation, and cruelty in general. The response that a livable future demands and that accrues to everyone in South Africa cannot simply be one of articulating a set of research agendas and platforms. It needs instead to be reflective of a set of ethical values and practices that will provide a counter to racial hate, humiliation, and cruelty. It's an enormous responsibility, and is writ large in the contract between a society and its universities, between the students and her or his professors. This is a simultaneously political and intellectual commitment that are central to the research platforms, the exchanges, and the structures that constitute this collaboration. To attend to questions like this, critical humanities require, I suppose, a commitment to close reading and to critique. Critique understood not as judgment, but as a practice. And it's a practice that derives from a post-colonial, post-disciplinary, post-apartheid thinking. So the various research platforms in this collaboration take the South African post-apartheid as a point of departure, but always also think beyond the geohistorical framework of the South African particular. They're concerned to think about what a post-colonial and post-apartheid critique and method might look like, and where the critical theoretical work of deconstruction, of essentialisms, of conceptual reflection, of genealogies, of genres and concepts and methods, of challenging the assumptions of history and other disciplines might productively take us. Beyond abstraction and theorization, though, the collaboration has also supported a substantive and expansive program of research in archives, in the field, with texts, the spoken word, photography and artworks and objects, auditory and visual media, and a pedagogy that reflects this. The collaboration thus has tried to enable a new political strategy of criticism, following James Scott, and a new intellectual desire that tries to make sure that critical theory does not simply become a circular intellectual academic exercise, but that it instead produces the grounds upon which new approaches to the urgent needs of society, the human subject and governance in post-apartheid South Africa and beyond, can emerge. In more concrete applied terms, what this means is that the collaboration is self-consciously committed to producing the conditions in which the community, researchers and scholars can begin to meet the challenges of post-apartheid South Africa and of the global world, while also attending to the losses, disappointments and challenges that have accompanied the work so far. It does this by connecting a critical theoretical approach to assumptions about society and social change, by reconsidering research methods and models by which we understand society and social change, and by reconsidering the practices and the infrastructure in which social actors, institutions, and agencies enact society and social change. So let me move on to the pedagogy. Through these various research platforms and through the establishment of institutional structures for the production of scholarship and the presentation and conducting of research, the collaboration has also responded to the concerns about the future of higher education in South Africa and in Africa more generally, and has begun to address pedagogical and institutional transformations that might alter the production of knowledge, not just at African universities and South African universities, but also at North American universities. It's also considering relations of knowledge exchange between universities in the North and universities in the South, and between historically white and historically black universities in South Africa. The participants in the collaboration have been continuously concerned with this pedagogy and with enabling graduate students to work through what we call the epistemic knots posed by interdisciplinarity and by the practices and assumptions of the various disciplines. And work in seminars, reading groups, and the so-called winter school have built on a substantial graduate student presentation and participation and consultation. They have provided, these structures have, for our students in South Africa and in the US, because this is a dual exchange, an institutional framework for teaching, reading, research, and scholarly debate, ordinarily absent from South African PhD programs which are not based in coursework, and from which we have learned a lot in terms of our own graduate teaching here at Minnesota. What we've also created is a new network of scholars and intellectual changes, which goes through the graduate student body, through the various disciplines, not just in history, and across these institutions. At the center of this collaboration is something that we've called the Winter School, which is committed to a space. It's called the Winter School because it's in June, July, August in South Africa, which is the winter there and the summer here. So haven't had much of a summer in the last few years. The Winter School is committed to creating a space for discussion, presentation, and responses to questions around the humanities, the philosophy of history, and the challenges of critical theory. It's also committed to sustaining critical engagement with texts, with theory, and with concepts, and to exploring genealogies of thinking and critique. And it's also primarily in bringing the students and faculty work to the same table, thinking about how individual work relates to these concepts and arguments, and how texts that we use in the winter schools relate to the work of individual participants. Okay, I am almost there. The most recent winter school was entitled Race. I'm just going to give you one example. The most recent winter school, and it was entitled Race for the Humanities, asked, for example, and it asked what it means to teach the debate about race in the humanities. Rather than simply defining race or creating a balance sheet of its equivalences like caste and its various variations, the winter school tried to think about the strategies through which the problems of race have been addressed and contested in the discourse of the humanities. Some of this was directed at thinking race as historically specific, but more importantly, we also looked at how race continues to function in disciplinary configurations and institutional formations by naming populations and prescribing articulations of difference. There's a new project afoot that will be launched next year in August, which will address the question of what it might mean to place art instead of the archive or evidence at the center of a historical reading. But perhaps I can talk about that at a little bit more length in the question and answer session. I have two more brief things I want to talk about. One of the things is what we have learned from this collaboration, which has built on existing committed intellectual, personal, and institutional relationships. But collaborative work is painstaking and time-consuming. So a lot of attention in the last few years has gone into building the infrastructure and developing the pedagogy, which becomes increasingly difficult as you have a more demanding cohort of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who are also increasingly more sophisticated in their work at 3 institutions in 2 countries, across different academic cultures and in different cultural settings, and across several generations of scholars, so MA students, PhD students, postdocs, and faculty. One of our colleagues from McGill University, Professor John Sosky, recently commented on the collaboration and said that he's always a bit amazed, to quote him, how invisible these interventions are in what has been constituted as the field. So one of the things that is set to counter this presentations like this, but also a very rigorous schedule of publishing and presentation that we have embarked on at various conferences, and which always already includes the work of graduate students, not just the work of faculty. So the collaboration between the 3 universities substantially contributes to the work of the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change and its intellectually and politically important work in the institutions and graduate community at this university. But the collaboration's firm grounding of a social change agenda in a critical post-colonial humanities framework and conceptualization provides a way forward for this community and for its partners in negotiating the critical questions of the present, to which a traditional social science-based, interventionist North American approach seems to have had few adequate answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Got 1 or 2 quick questions.
You want to do immediate questions?
Well, we can do a couple of follow-up questions and then we'll have a question session.
In your discussions, what has come to the forefront as far as trends for African higher education in the future?
Wow, trends.
Or transformation, you were talking.
Well, transformations, so here I can speak most specifically for South Africa, where there are now collaborations exactly like this that are trying to counter the isolation of particularly PhD students in programs that are not course-based. And so what we've created is kind of an infrastructure between this university and those 2 that provides kind of a model for what a graduate education might look like, that is, where you cannot actually put courses in place because the system doesn't allow it. It's the old English system, and so it doesn't allow it. This project is very fast expanding, and the South African government has recently is thinking about creating a structure by which this is even formalized and infused with money through the research chair system that they have in South Africa, which allows professors to fund graduate students, and with this collaboration allows us to move graduate students not just between universities in South Africa but to universities here and vice versa. So there's a real sense of that this is a project that teaching is a project that we don't direct from here, but that takes its cues from the needs in South Africa, but that we are actually now learning from in terms of how our students learn. And at the heart of it is not just the structure, the funding, the programs, but the focus on an intellectual project and strong intellectual leadership and the work that entails, which is slow, extremely slow, as we know here as well.
Okay, thank you. We need to move on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Sergei Katsev. I'm with the Large Lakes Observatory on Duluth campus. I'm also with the Department of Physics there. So I have received 2 grants, one as a lead PI and another as a co-PI. One focused on, Lake Kivu. As you can guess from the name of my department, I work on lakes. Lake Kivu towards the safe and environmentally responsible use of a unique geoenergy resource, which is a fancy word for methane. And another one was on the work on Lake Malawi. So I'll relatively briefly talk about what we're trying to do there. But since this is such an interdisciplinary session, I'll try to reflect on the challenges that we encounter there, the opportunities, and how we can go forward with this. Well, the focus of both of these grants is Africa. So there is a chain of very large lakes spanning the East African Rift. We focus on 2 of them, although we do keep an eye on pretty much all of them. Lake Malawi is down there at the bottom, and Lake Kivu is in the middle. It's the smallest of the large lakes at the headwaters of the entire system. Of course, these are the natural wonders of the world. They include the largest lake, second largest lake by surface area, the second deepest lake in the world. Lake Malawi, it's the lake with the highest fish endemism, an extremely interesting ecosystem. And Lake Kivu, which I will talk about, which is probably the most dangerous lake in the world. And that is why we wanted to study it. These lakes are, of course, extremely important for the local populations. These are the poorest regions on the planet. The southern end of Lake Malawi, because of the upwelling, supports an extremely productive fisheries, and people really depend on it. When the ship comes back and unloads the fish, the entire village lines up to get. This is their main source of protein. So the projects that we conducted there was aimed primarily at investigating the sustainability of that fisheries, looking at the nutrient cycling, looking at the carbon cycling, looking at the incidences of fish kills, how the lake responds to the global warming, how nutrient delivery will be changed by the warming climate, and so on. We also looked at the lake levels. There is a project that involves US money of building a hydroelectric dam on the river. So we're looking at the climate scenarios, and some of them indicate that the river may not be flowing in 20 years because of the drying up of the climate. So we work on big vessels, big equipment, deploying lots of instruments into the lake for several years. This project, I think, had 15 PIs from both the Twin Cities and the Duluth campus. Pretty large undertaking. Another project on Lake Kivu was smaller in scale, and it was quite different in the topic. So Lake Kivu is quite interesting in the way that it sits right next to the most active volcanoes in Africa. And those volcanoes supply dissolved gases to the bottom of that lake, and that lake happens to be meromictic, meaning it doesn't mix. So those gases can accumulate in the deep waters of the lake. That's an editorial from Nature magazine. So what happens when the gases accumulate in the deep waters of the lake? They accumulate to the concentrations that if you bring this water to the surface, it starts to bubble. It forms bubbles of both methane and CO2. So if something happens and this water rises, for example, there is some convection in the lake, the bubbles that form will entrain the water. It will cause the water to rise, more bubbles will form. So basically what you get is what you observe when you open a Coke bottle or a beer bottle. The entire lake would foam up, release huge quantities of gas, cubic miles and miles of gas. That gas is heavy as an air. It can displace air, and if this cloud of gas drifts ashore, it would asphyxiate people just by displacing the air. There are about 2 million people living by the shores of this lake. This did happen before, not in this lake, but on a much smaller scales in 2 lakes in Cameroon. They exploded. That's called the limnic eruption. And 2,000 people died from a lake that's about 2 kilometers across. Lake Kivu is 60 kilometers across and much deeper. So following the disasters in Cameroon, a pipe was installed into the lake that degassed the lake safely through the pipe rather than through an explosive process. This is a 50-meter fountain that's self-sustained. It doesn't require pumping. It's sustained by the pressure of gas in the lake. So if you're sitting at a restaurant overlooking Lake Kivu and you look closely up there, you see a structure on the lake. This structure is the methane extraction plant that's owned by the Rwandan government. This plant has a pipe that goes down 300 meters into the lake, and it pumps water and it scrubs the methane from the water. It transits through a series of scrubbers. It ships the methane via pipeline onshore, where it's burned in big generators for electricity. So this plant generates a couple of megawatts of electricity. There was that was a pilot project. There is another much bigger project that's run by an American company, Contour Global, with plans to provide 100 megawatts of power. And 100 megawatts of power for the US, it's about the size of an average coal burning plant. For the Rwanda, that's 3 times the electricity consumption of Rwandan economy. At the present. This is a big project. So we were looking at the sustainability of that, at the methane cycle, and what happens to the lake as the lake warms up. We're working with African partners, taking students from the Rwandan universities to work, working with Malawi Fisheries Department. We were using their vessel, their crew, to work on the lake. So we have a history of interacting both with the universities and the government agencies there. And the story of interaction provides 2 very contrasting sides. On one side, we have Rwanda, which has received enormous amounts of international aid because of the genocide. So this is how the campus of Kigali Institute of Science and Technology looks like. These are their labs. This looks much better than my lab at UMD. They have very expensive instruments. Well, it doesn't come without problems. Getting consumables for any chemical analysis extremely difficult. You have to wait 3 months. You have to order them. In Europe, they come via Uganda or Kenya by trucks. It's really even the most basic things, the ones that we don't think about. Vials, compressed gases, things like that. Another problem is technical expertise. Basically, they have a technician who sits there in that lab and tells everybody, don't enter, don't touch anything, you'll break it. And the technician himself cannot run it because he doesn't have an expertise. So he's in charge of material assets, but there is nobody there to use it. The situation is very different in Malawi. This is the entirety of their library at the Department of Fisheries. Facilities are almost non-existent. They have a couple of boats to monitor the lake, but they don't have fuel for the boat. And their budgets are approved on a bi-weekly basis, so they don't know if they will have money to monitor the lake in the next 2 weeks. And there is very little will to invest in areas that do not show immediate economic benefit. So they like partnering with us, but they don't like providing resources, or sometimes they can't as a government. But the biggest challenge that I observed was really investing in people. When you go to these places, you can see very bright people who are very motivated, but who cannot get education. They would like to go to the US, they would like to get a master's or PhD, but, well, there are difficulties involved in that, and I'll talk about this in a minute. Technical expertise, just having technicians trained is very important. Quite often they say, don't send us money, send us your technician who would run a workshop here, who would teach us how to use these machines. We have the machines, we don't have the expertise. And sending technicians sometimes is more important, but it's also more difficult in terms of funding, how to do it. So I tried to summarize this in a slide, dividing the slide into opportunities and challenges. So on one hand, we have an extremely important aspect of interaction where we can either send our technicians over there, or we can bring African students to here and train them. But that's, of course, quite difficult. Well, sending technicians, if you have a grant, that's great. If you don't, it's difficult, and sometimes it's difficult to write this sort of exchange in a grant. Bringing up students, well, I hope there is some discussion on the ways to bring up African students to here, because, well, there is a small number of fellowships, and it's difficult to get tuition waiver. Rwandan government has an agency whose mission is to send students abroad, and by African standards, they provide a lot of money. They provide about $15,000 a year for a student. UMD, at least, I'm not sure about the Twin Cities campus, UMD does not waive tuition, so that doesn't go far enough. These students cannot come. Also, of course, because of their education, they are not competitive relative to the students that we would normally accept into our master's and PhD students. So if I'm looking for a student who would do work for me, generate scientific papers, generate grants, I would rather take a German student than a Rwandan student. Or sometimes they would not be able to complete a master's that I would consider be worthy of University of Minnesota. So we need to have a discussion about what standards we would expect from these students when they're coming into the program and coming out of the program. So funding, of course, it's always a problem. Well, we've been successful at getting funding from MacArthur Foundation for Lake Kivu and FAO for Lake Malawi. We had negotiations with World Bank. IONE, Institute on the Environment here in Minneapolis, also funded some of our work. This is all great. On the other hand, if you work with UN agencies, you know how extremely frustrating it can be with the level of bureaucracy and the number of meetings you have to go to before you can actually apply for funding. In our field, when we go to NSF is interested in fundamental science. They're not interested in ecology, studying a particular lake, helping people develop. If you want to get NSF funding, you have to come up with a fundamental science that you cannot do anywhere. There is not a senator from Rwanda, a senator from Malawi. So the mission of NSF is not to support those countries. It's not a very good source of funding for us. Another aspect is that while it's great that we've established these contacts, the most useful instrument in Africa is a cell phone with these phone numbers of people who you can call. But people change jobs in Africa. an average lifespan of a person on a job in Rwanda, I think it's about 5 months. They switch positions within the government, so you lose your contacts really quickly. I think it's really important to have institutional involvement, which is more difficult. It's easy to get a particular person to say, okay, I'll help you, I have a driver, and I'll send my students with you on a field work. It's more difficult and to get formal institutional involvement from an African institution that would continue for several years. The local government support in Rwanda, we had extremely good local government support. Their president actually now has an idea that, well, they want Rwanda to be best in something. Basically, think big. If you want a center, scientific center on East African lakes based in Rwanda, tell us. We might try to make it happen. That's quite an exception. In Malawi, the government is eyeing what's just in front of them. In particular, in these lakes, they're giving out concessions on oil drilling in the lake. This dominates the agenda. So people who are supposed to be thinking about fish are thinking about oil, and they don't care about studying fish anymore. Their focus is very short term, and you cannot really blame them, but when agencies try to fund this kind of work, this kind of perspective of the local government need to be kept in mind. Okay, so thank you very much. I guess I have to time myself. Maybe one quick question. Karen.
Can you say a little bit about how you address this barrier to institutional involvement, or what strategies you might have to suggest for that?
So in Malawi, we did actually have an MOU with a college in Malawi. It seemed like a good idea. In practice, I cannot say that it did much because, well, it still ends up being dependent on the efforts of individuals, and those individuals are typically not high in power. They are people at the level of lecturers and individual professors. In Rwanda, we did have commitment from the dean and also from people fairly high in the Ministry of Infrastructure. People in the Ministry of Infrastructure was really helpful. The dean was willing to help as a person, but because of the internal constraints within the institution, he could not even sign anything claiming support from the university. And we could not. We were thinking about having joint programs, educational programs, but they did not have degrees that were closely matched to what we wanted to do. So that didn't work. They were interested in developing them, but it's quite difficult to start from scratch. So I cannot say that we made good progress there. We tried, but okay. There you go.
So the timer doesn't come on? Can you time me?
Yes, I'll time you. It does show you the timing for the presentation.
Okay, so...
Where is that? There.
Oh, there it goes.
Okay.
Okay. Hello. My name is Lorena Munoz, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society. And I want to thank the Global Spotlight. I received a major faculty grant, and I'm pretty appreciative of being able to gain that initial secure funding, then to kind of branch it out and look for additional funding for the larger project. So this is part of a larger project in which I'm involved in, that it's a study of 3 immigrants receiving cities across the Americas. First one is Los Angeles, second one is Cancun, which is this slice of the project, and the third one is Bogota. So I had this, let me see, oops. No. How do I'm a Mac person.
No?
There it goes. Okay. So I had this big, huge presentation, and it's 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to cut it. First of all, this is about the city of Cancun, and you can see it's located in the Yucatan Peninsula. But Cancun actually this year and in this month turned 40. So it's a really young city, and it's an incredibly young state in Mexico. This is a photograph of Cancun in the 1960s. So as you can see, this city was actually built over land that was untouched for the last probably like 80 years before it was built. So even though they are remnants of Mayan towns and villages in this area, it was no longer a fisherman's area before it became the planned city of Cancun. So the story of Cancun goes that in the 1960s, as part of the modernization project of Mexico, trying to be, kind of looking towards the north, towards the United States, figuring out how is it that they're going to bring more capital into the country to modernize it. They already had two pretty successful tourism projects in Mexico. One is Acapulco, the other one is Puerto Vallarta, and Cancun became the third one. Cancun, where the actual hotel zone is, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there's the city of Cancun that's inland, and then the hotel zone, the tourist sites, it's in an actual island. So that is an island, and they need to build a bridge, which Daniel Ortiz, who was the first engineer, who basically is the founder of Cancun, established the first labor camp in 1968, in which they had to bring in Mayans working in the gum industry with the gum trees to come in and set up the first labor camp, because there weren't any people around, like kilometers inhabiting the space, so there was no labor force, so they needed to import it. So basically Cancun, it rises out of incredibly diverse migrant populations that come from all over Mexico, but also all over the United States. So this project, and this is how it started to sell and all that, but what this project basically was about is it had three major objectives. One was to further understand how immigrants create street vending systems across immigrant receiving spaces in Cancun. Also to analyze how these systems are created, when and where they operate, who participates, who consumes what, and how they appear and disappear. And the last one is to identify local state vending policies, strategies, and practices that are most compatible within the street vending population of Cancun. This was by far the most important kind of like activist stand that our research team had, because not unlike any other immigrant receiving cities across the world, which has a high street vending and formal economy population, there are numerous ways in which this population is incredibly marginalized and incurs violence by the state and enforcement. And in Cancun, there are ways in which the population has been able to inhabit a quasi-formal, informal space of street vending, which could be an example, who knows, to other cities to take on. So what did the fieldwork looks like? This is what I'm actually going to present, because we have collected all the data, but we're currently inputting it, and we haven't really analyzed any of it. So I'm just basically going to talk about what did the fieldwork look like, right? So it was Definitely an ethnography. We did participant observation, shadowing of people, shadowing of street vendors. We conducted numerous informal interviews whenever we had an opportunity. We definitely let go the whole structure of this is exactly what we need to ask, but just kind of took advantage of any opportunity we had just living in these spaces in order to basically learn about it and conduct informal interviews. We did have formal interviews, especially of stakeholders, surveys, and mapping. But it's not the sophisticated mapping that we usually talk about in geography. It was actually pen and paper, going there and drawing every stall, every vendor, what are they selling, codes for like gender, where they're from, etc. So it was kind of like really on the ground, everyday, embodied experience of field work. Well, we had a research team. I was the co-PI of this grant. I'm the PI of this grant. The co-PI is Sobeida Bonilla, who is in the School of Public Health. We had a faculty coordinator from our partner university in Cancun, which was the Universidad del Caribe. We had an undergraduate student coordinator from the University of Las Americas in Puebla, she basically was like a PhD student. She was amazing. And then we had 14 undergraduate students from the Universidad del Caribe, and then we had a mapping coordinator, the actual person who went and mapped all the stalls and everything. The important thing about this is how we recruited the students is Cancun per se doesn't have a geography department. It doesn't have even like a sociology, cultural anthropology department. So the closest departments that we found were in Chetumal, that was 3 hours away. So it was impossible to make collaborations with students so far away. So we recruited students that were studying tourism, right? Which was really interesting to figure out later how that impacted the students as well, knowing that this was a project about tourism, just a very different way in which they're learning about tourism, right? About like respect the tourists, how do you bring tourists in? All of these notions about how is it that one can build a sustainable life based on tourism and capital accumulation in that way. So for a period of 2 months in phase 1, we shadowed street vendors from different places in different settings in the different areas of Cancun. We had informal meetings with people, and we tried to figure out who were the key actors and the key players in the street vending world in Cancun. We also did participant observation. We worked as street vendors, the co-PI and myself in different ways, different times. And then we also gathered information from the INEGI, which is the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, because they have their own series of surveys that they implement across the nation, and we wanted to be able to later correlate some of our questions that we asked in relation to the larger nation project. So we did that. We also, prepared the survey with input of this organization and prepared materials and training manuals. So we constructed from scratch a 50-page manual in Spanish about how to conduct surveys, how to conduct interviews, what to do in different situations, because we were sending students to areas that are informal settlements, right? That the police, nobody's around, so they were in areas that weren't completely safe in some ways. So basically there was a lot of training about what to do in certain circumstances. So this was the training that took place. These were some of the students or the student workers that we had. We paid the students and the person who took the survey the same amount of money. So we paid every street vendor who took our survey, which was a super long survey, $20, but we also paid the student who implemented the survey $20. So there was pay equity in that. So some of the things that we did is did a mini pilot to figure out how the survey was going to work. And this was the first kind of like major finding that we got to. And this one was the way in which indigeneity was defined, right? In the national survey, indigeneity consists of very specific categories. And we utilize these categories in Cancun, which we know now, it's a migrant receiving city with many different forms of indigeneity. And it was completely different, the way people think about themselves in relation to being indigenous and tied to the land versus how the nation imagines indigenous people, who consist of being indigenous in Mexico. So for example, in Cancun, a student who was in our project, he is first generation Mayan in Cancun. So he was born in the city of Cancun. His parents are from a village, a Mayan village in Yucatan. And him being born in Cancun and speaking Spanish, even though phenotypically and all of the familial ties are Mayan, he now becomes mestizo, right, and becomes non-indigenous. So for us, just basically based on the phenotype, I mean, we were confused because nationally, indigeneity is defined very different. He would be indigenous, just in a different category. So we had to redo the whole, all of the sections of how people consider themselves, ask different questions. So we had to, do that in a small pilot to come back, redo it, and then retrain students and then send them out. So one of the organizations that we worked with, which is the organization that we're highlighting through this project, is the Unión de Tianguis y Comerciantes Ambulantes, which basically it's the street vending union, but it's not a union per se like we think of unions here. It's a membership organization that basically in the 1980s, where a lot of the vendors were completely removed from the tourist sites, they decided to create this organization in order to, collaboratively with the new informal settlements, with the residents there, be able to have some sort of a collaborative vending strategy in which they participated in vending by offering their sidewalks of their homes in their different neighborhoods, and then people would come and sell, and they would, charge a peso to go and use their bathroom, or they themselves benefited by utilizing their driveway and putting a makeshift, beauty parlor, or selling books or selling anything that you have from your house. So this became like a joint venture between the residents and the people that were coming to sell. So in phase 2, this is when we actually collected the data. We went into the tianguis, which the largest one is on Sunday. Every day there's a tianguis every single day of the week. On Sunday, in the evening, there's a tianguis that has around 10,000 stalls in a particular neighborhood, and about 40,000 people come and hang out. And you can buy anything you want or think about. There's a huge diversity of products. So we implemented 100 surveys within tianguis, and then 100 surveys with vendors outside of these quasi-formal selling spaces. So we would have people who still not incorporate into this semi-structured formal setting and were even marginalized from there. So there's like this hierarchy of marginalization. We also mapped all of the vending sites and what they sold and all that, and I talked about a little bit about that. So these are pictures of the tianguis. You can see there, this organization hires a full-time nurse and a part-time nurse aide. You can see right there. For the people, if either a customer that goes to the tianguis or somebody who works there, if something happens, if they faint, especially because of the heat or whatever. So minor kind of like first emergency care services they provide. They also hire street cleaners. They have a staff of 12 full-time street cleaners. They have security guards. I mean, it's like a mini like empire of being able to sell. And as you can see here, there's more photographs, and I'm almost done. And phase 3, we're now coding the data. We're doing data entry. We're hoping to analyze the data soon, and we're applying for funding for the third country, which is in Colombia. So, thank you.
Questions?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, you. Sorry.
I just had 2 questions about the surveying techniques that you use. So sampling, how did you figure that out? And then also with the equity pay, why did you decide to do that, and how do you think it affected?
Well, Mexico is an incredibly class system, so just having students go to the university and then interact with street vendors, it's something that the students usually wouldn't do, especially studying tourism. It's like they're looking for kind of like mobility upwards rather than making networks or even thinking or acknowledging or even engaging with everyday folks and at the margin. So their work was incredibly valuable, just as the labor that the vendors had in answering the survey. It was time that we were taking them from actually working, so that time was valuable to us. So basically establishing an equity of pay allowed them to be, in the same kind of like acknowledging that both labors are incredibly important and valuable. So.
And how did you decide to do sampling for this?
Right. So sampling was really interesting because at first we tried to gather maps of the city, and the actual city of Cancun, the planning agency, their latest maps are from 2000. So there's this private company or private guy who did GIS, basically went to Cancun, said, oh, there's no mapping, and we can sell this data to the census. So basically this guy went to every single informal settlement and mapped out by foot and all of that, every single home and everything that was happening. So basically I had to go and buy from him the maps, which were incredibly expensive. And then from that, we basically divided the city into different zones. And we sent each student we divided equally, and depending on if they had more vending sites than others, of the actual city of Cancun, not tourist areas. So we tried to do it more equitable in that way, especially to be able to implement surveys to vendors who are not in any type of organization, but they're just selling, on the street, one day in one street, another day in another.
Did you track across inside of the organized, semi-organized market outside? Did you match types of things that people were selling? Imagine there's a lot of people are selling all sorts of products, and maybe they're treated differently or earning different amounts of money or different legitimacy based on what they sell. Right.
So even within the organization, there are different tiers of selling depending on how much you're going to pay, right? I mean, the pay is minimal, but it's still a pay structure. So if you just want to sell, and if you just want the protection and to pay the most minimal amount, then you get a little piece on a sidewalk in front of somebody's house. If you want to pay more, then you can have a stall and whatever. So people who sold typically food, prepared food, or chickens, especially if they have live chickens there, and then they kill one and they give it to you. Things, they need more space. But other than that, recyclers, people, especially housekeepers from large hotels, large resorts, when you go to a resort like that and you leave a half-empty shampoo bottle, right, or conditioner or tanning oil, whatever you leave there, ends up at these Stanleys, because then somebody like that could come on a Sunday and only pay for the small, space and put a variety of, half-empty bottles of anything, especially U.S. products, and then sell them, right? Because that is the way that people can actually get shampoo or, toothpaste or anything else. So there's definitely a huge diversity of selling. And most of the people who have like their stall and have been selling for a long time, they all came to work in the hotel industry. But there was a lot of violence, especially with the real unions, the labor unions in the hotels. Sexual assault, rapes, holding pay. I mean, there's a huge gendered dynamic of that aspect, and some of them decided that it wasn't worth it to do that, and then actually have subsisted for years and put their kids through college and all that, selling in the informal economy. So, all right, well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have run out of time for this session, so if you have further questions, I'm sure you can ask the speakers during lunch. Thank you.
Interesting.